Chapter 10. Knives and Fists. Old Stormy was a fine old man, to me way o storm along. Old Stormy was a fine old man, way hey hey Mr. Storm along. Capstan Shanty. One day at sea, Bert discovered, is astonishingly like the day before, and the day before that. 4 hours on and 8 hours off, 4 hours on, 8 hours off, day after day, night after night, and nothing to mark the passage of a 24-hour cycle, except the dog watches between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. You forgot the day of the week and the day of the month, since there was scant use for dates, and you marked time by just one thing, the number of days at sea. Any man in the crew, from half-witted Barney, who took care of the 40 hogs in their pens on top of the hatches, to the captain himself, could tell you, without an instant's hesitation, 9 days out this morning. Even Sparks, in his brief daily news bulletin, began, "Aboard the bark Queen of Asia, 9 days out, 1,150 miles west of San Francisco." 1,150 miles west of San Francisco. That was the most important part of Sparks' bulletin, the part first read and most discussed. But strangely enough, the men always knew the distance run in the previous 24 hours and the total distance before the bulletin appeared, and placed bets on the accuracy of their estimates. "The second mate says by the log we do 10 knots for 2 hours last night," argued a long-armed Dane. "I don't care what Poker Gus says," another sailor answered. "I was sailing deep-water ships when Gus was a pup, and I know that for 3 days we don't do more as 9 knots, and now we do 4, maybe 4.5. Look." Bert stopped his pacing by the side of Fred von Bergen, the German sailor, to watch with other sailors the green and white waves slipping along the vessel's side. After more than a week of practice, Bert found that he could estimate the bark's speed nearly as well as the old sailors. "I should call it 5. He said in an aside to the German. "Und? So should I, my boy. You will make a sailor yet. But unless I am mistaken, this old hulk will need soldiers more than sailors before this voyage is finished." Bert looked at his friend sharply. "What makes you think so?" he asked. "Because," the German said slowly, "there is trouble in the air. I can feel it so, like a pressure. These men," he indicated the restless pacing crew, "they feel it." His voice grew tense, scarcely more than a hoarse whisper. "Those black men, they are like children. They laugh and cry, but they do not think. They will obey a clever man who gives them snow, cocaine. The Mexicans, they have partly developed souls, and they were born with knives in their hands. But the white men among them, they are the worst. Ugh, God, half man and half devil. They are the real troublemakers. Learn all you can how to be a good sailor, my boy, but do not forget how to fight." Most of the China gang seemed to be on deck now, leaning over the bulwarks or milling tirelessly about the deck, on top of the covered piles. More than ever, as he listened to the German's words, Bert felt the strange, sinister quality of the China gang. Supposedly docile laborers of the meanest sort, there was yet about them, taken as a gang, a forbidding, menacing air. Not the menace of brute force, so much as the worse menace of the unknown, of tremendous, latent power. It seemed to the boy as though he and the score of other seamen in their little promenade were prisoners in a pit, around which myriads of jungle beasts circled endlessly, waiting. Fred von Bergen was talking. Bert shook himself to throw off the fantastic vision, and listened. "They are the useless, what you call the incompetent members of society, the barnacles and weeds that grow on the bottom of a ship. They should be scraped off from civilization every so often, just as you scrape the growth from a ship's bottom, so to make it move more easily." But after all, they are human beings, Bert protested. Of course, they have in our standards. He paused a moment to digest a new thought. When he said our standards, he had unconsciously classed himself with the seamen, thinking of seamen's standards rather than those of A.K. Lindsay's family. They have in our standards, he went on, but perhaps they enjoy life in their own way, as much as we do in ours. Ja, sure, agreed the German, knocking his big clay pipe gently against his heel. Und the ship's rats, they enjoy life too, ja, but we kill them. Before Bert could answer, a disturbance cut short the conversation. Half a dozen men barked curt orders of unwelcome at a Mexican who had stepped down the sailor's sacred deck space and was calmly filling a tin cup from the crew's tank of drinking water. Beat it, Jose. Vamos, get out. Jump, you lousy greaser. The brawny arm of Oscar Sandstrom, who weighed, Bert guessed, 225 pounds without an ounce of fat, circled the Mexican's waist from behind and lifted him screaming oaths from the deck. Instantly, the other seamen fell back, grinning, to give the boatswain room. With an apparently effortless swing, Oscar sent the Mexican flying through the air to fall heavily on the planks 15 feet away and roll against the feet of some of his comrades. For a moment, he lay inert. Then he whipped to his feet like a sprung trap, and as he rose, Bert saw a knife flash in his hand. Without a sound, he leapt at the big Swede. Massive and powerful as the Swede was, the odds were by no means all in his favor. The lithe little Mexican was like a swift bombing plane attacking a sluggish battleship. The fight might be all over before the battleship could get into action. In the space of time between two breaths, the knife flashed upward and down. The great fist of the sailor landed on the chest of the Mexican with a crushing blow that had started when the Mexican was halfway back and sent him flying through the air again, doubled up like a jackknife. And the Swede was gazing with surprised eyes at a stream of blood that flowed down his left arm and formed a little crimson pool on the tarred deck. A grunt of surprised approval from the crew greeted the boatswain's blow, and there were instant jests at sight of the soaring Mexican's second plunge to the deck. Then a seaman caught sight of the stream of blood. "The greaser knifed Oscar!" he cried. Instantly, 20 pairs of eyes focused on the widening splotch of red on Oscar's shirt sleeve and followed the sluggish stream down his arm till it fell, drip, 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 to the deck. Bert remembered the hours that the big Swede had spent patiently teaching him knots and splices. Slowly his anger at the Mexican welled up. The Mexican had no business taking water from the crew's drinking tank. He had but to walk forward to the larger tank that supplied the China gang. It was sheer laziness on his part, and he deserved his punishment. Yet he had tried to kill Oscar. Bert was unaware at the time that every seaman present was experiencing the same emotions. He was thinking with the pack, and the pack had seen the blood of a comrade spilled. A low murmur of anger rose from the seamen, a murmur that was echoed by the brown men who stared at the unconscious body of their fellow. And like an echo that swelled instead of growing fainter, the murmur reverberated until it had grown to a furious roar. With Scandinavian slowness to anger, the crew was a second later than the quick, black-eyed men in their decision to fight. But that second was enough to make the China gang the attackers and the crew the defenders. Across Bert's mind as the attack came flashed again the vision of the jungle pit, this time with the blood-hungry jungle beasts tired of waiting, closing in on their victims. But the occupants of the pit on the Queen of Asia's deck were not helpless. On the contrary, they were strong men, fretted with inactivity, to whom a fight would mean a joyous chance to release pent-up energy. Their battle cry as they struck out with bare fists or the few weapons that came to hand sounded to Bert more like the glad shout of schoolboys plunging into a rough-and-tumble snow fight than like the cry of men facing deadly knives wielded by skillful hands. Grabbing a heavy oak marlin spike 1.5 feet long, which another seaman had thrown down as a less effective weapon than bare fists, Bert pressed toward the port side of the deck space, the side from which the attack came. He darted for a narrow opening between the closely packed sailors, but before he could get within striking distance of the nearest attacker, a heavy hand on his shoulder sent him spinning backward out of the fray. Fred von Bergen took the place that he had unwillingly vacated. The German was trying to keep him out of the fight so he wouldn't be hurt, and he wanted to fight, wanted to help quell this riot at once, but mostly he sought blind revenge for the knifing of Oscar. With a laugh that turned into a sob, he threw himself forward again, dimly conscious of a shrill whistle from aft and the crashing shut of an iron door. Close to his ears, the gasps and low curses of the white men and the shrilled Spanish oaths of the brown men played an accompaniment to the staccato cracks of hard fists against hard flesh. The odor of sweating men was strong in his nostrils. So tightly was he wedged between the heaving bodies of the sailors that he had not room to swing his marlinspike against a contorted brown face that pressed close to him. While he struggled to free himself, he was picked up bodily and hurled to the rear again, where, to his astonishment, he brought up in the arms of another Mexican. Even as he cried a warning to the others of this new attack from the rear, his left hand shot up almost instinctively and gripped the Mexican's bony right wrist. With all his strength, he resisted the downward pressure and twisted. Would the fellow never let go? Silently, pressed close together, they strained. How would it feel, Bert wondered, to have a knife plunge into your body? If his grip weakened, at last the wrist gave a little, and a clasp knife with a 5-inch blade rattled to the deck. With a kick, Bert sent it spinning across the deck to wedge under the deck load out of reach of an arm. Then, with a gasp of relief, he flung the man away from him and looked about in a clear zone between two battle lines. More seamen leapt from their bunks in the deckhouse to join the fray, and these had met and turned the attack from the rear while Bert grappled with the Mexican. On the port side, the attack was turning rapidly into a retreat when the arrival of Carl Jensen, the chief mate, and Charlie Hansen, the third mate, each swinging a 6-foot oak capstan bar, turned the retreat into a panic. All the fight battered out of them, the tween-deckers turned away from the pile-driver fists of the crew and fled aft. Thwarted from escaping into the tween-decks by the locked iron doors in the after-deck-house, they huddled in the corner formed by the cab in bulkhead and the lee bulwarks. Silently, without orders, the crew formed a close line to keep them there, disarm them, and send them below. It was the seemingly undisturbed voice of the captain, who stood on the poop looking down on the scene. While his order was being carried out, Bert walked back to the scene of the battle. The boatswain and the 3 other seamen sat at the edge of the hatch, nursing their cuts. One of them stuffed a pinch of snuff into his mouth, while he held the lips of a knife cut together with the other hand. 3 Mexicans and 2 Negroes lay unconscious on the planks. Bert recovered and pocketed the knife he had twisted out of the Mexican's hand, and began an apparently aimless stroll about the decks and through the crew's quarters. It was not aimless, however. He was looking for the pock-marked man. Pete Condon had been present when the attack began, but Bert had not seen him during the fight, and now he was nowhere to be found. After a 15-minute search of the bark from stem to stern, Bert returned to the after-deckhouse hatch, down which the last of the defeated fighters who were able to walk were being herded. Pete Condon must be in the tween-decks. Had he dashed below at the start of the fight and been caught there when the mate locked the doors to prevent the rest of the gang from joining the fight? "Where's that doctor?" bellowed the chief mate. "Why isn't he taking care of these men?" "I think he's below," volunteered a seaman. "He was down there, playing poker an hour ago." Captain Hagestrom descended the steps from the poop to the main deck and walked to the iron door of the deckhouse hatch. The chief mate stepped forward quickly and laid a hand on the iron handle an instant before the captain reached it. Master and mate stood quietly facing each other. "Better let me go, Captain," said the mate. The captain turned away slowly. "Take some men with you," he mumbled. Bert's heart sang. Here were men it was a pleasure to take orders from. Real men. A ship's master who was willing to walk alone into a den of enraged cutthroats to fetch a doctor for his wounded men. A mate who would not allow his skipper to take such a chance but would take it himself without hesitation. The mate swung the door open and stepped inside. "2 men to go with me," he said over his shoulder. Bert was through the door before the words were out of the mate's mouth, and behind him came the first of 6 seamen who had stepped forward at the word. The mate had said too, so the other 5 stayed at the door, watching their descent.